She would learn his tattoos. Not the art of them, the weight. She would trace the unfinished rose on his knuckle with her eyes night after night until she understood that it was never meant for a woman. It was meant for a grave. Her father's grave. A punishment Romeo Ferrara had chosen, in the end, not to deliver. She would discover that the rule he was famous for, never touch the dead, had been written the year he was 22. The year a girl with dark eyes had disappeared from a neighborhood he used to own, and left behind nothing but a rumor and a guilt he'd been paying interest on ever since. She would learn that he had recognized her the moment she walked through his doors. Welcome to Roses and Revolvers, where every story leaves a scar. If stories like this keep you on the edge of your seat, hit subscribe and comment where you are watching from, because the next one might be even darker. That he had signed the ledger anyway. But Gianna Russo didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was the weight of the crimson silk against her skin, the color of it wrong in the way a wound is wrong, too red, too deliberate. The rose petals scattered across the white bed like evidence of something that hadn't happened yet. The scent of them thick and funereal, the kind of sweetness designed to mask something darker underneath. And the man standing with his back to her at the window. Romeo Ferrara. 36 years old. Chicago-born, Sicilian-rooted, the kind of name that didn't appear in newspapers because newspapers needed sources willing to sign their names. The kind of man whose silence in a room was louder than other men's threats. She had heard his name the way children hear about weather, as something coming, always coming, nothing you could stop. He didn't turn around when she entered. He didn't turn around when the door closed behind her. He simply said, without looking, "Sit down, Gianna." And her feet moved. She hated that her feet moved. She sat on the edge of the bed and the petals shifted beneath her and she thought, absurdly, of her mother's kitchen. The way her mother used to scatter dried lavender on the windowsill in winter, the way the apartment always smelled like something trying very hard to be beautiful despite the cold coming through the walls. The memory came before she could stop it. The hospital. The antiseptic corridor, fluorescent light buzzing above a plastic chair where she'd sat for 6 hours waiting for a doctor who kept forgetting to look at her when he spoke. Her mother's hands. God, her mother's hands. She'd memorized every vein, every knuckle, the paper-thin skin she'd held through 2 winters of treatments and 1 winter of hope. $200,000, the specialist had said, and we might be talking about years instead of months. They had never had $200,000. They had never had a father who stayed. What they had, it turned out, was a father who had borrowed $300,000 from people whose patience was measured in broken things and then vanished, and left behind a daughter as the only asset worth collecting. The 2 men in the parking garage had known her name before she said it. They had known her mother's name, too. They'd mentioned the hospital. Gently. The way you mention a loaded gun without pointing it, just so everyone understands it's in the room. Now she was in this room. And Romeo Ferrara finally turned around. And the way he looked at her, not like property, not like a transaction, but like a man who had been bracing himself for something for a very long time, made her breath catch in a way she did not yet have words for. He crossed the room slowly. He reached out. His tattooed hand, the rose, the unfinished rose, tilted her chin upward. And something in his expression cracked, just slightly, the way ice cracks before it gives way entirely. "Look at me," he said quietly. She already was. They didn't push her. That was the cruelest part. The woman who led her upstairs, mid-40s, pearls, the kind of face that had learned not to feel things, simply gestured down the hallway as if she were showing a guest to a room. As if this were a hotel. As if Gianna had chosen to be here. The master's suite door opened, and the first thing she saw was the dress. Crimson. Laid across the bed like a body. Like someone had already decided what she would look like for him. The rose petals came next, hundreds of them, blood dark against white linen, scattered with a care that made her stomach turn. Someone had taken time with this. Someone had stood in this room and made it beautiful for a transaction. She didn't cry. She was done crying in parking garages and hospital corridors. She had used everything up in rooms that mattered more than this one. She changed into the dress because there was nothing else to wear and because defiance required energy she was saving. Then she sat. And she waited. And the door at the end of the hall, the one the Pearl woman had glanced at once, quickly, the way you glance at something that frightens you, slowly began to open. He filled the doorway the way a storm fills a skyline, not loud, just inevitable. Romeo Ferrara didn't rush. Men like him never rushed. He shrugged his jacket from his shoulders in one slow motion and draped it over the chair by the door, and the casualness of it terrified her more than anger would have. Anger she could have understood. This calm felt like something that had already decided how the night would end. He crossed the room. Gianna's hands pressed flat against the mattress. She would not flinch. She had promised herself that much. He stopped in front of her. Close enough that she could see the tattoos clearly now, roses and thorns climbing his knuckles, one bloom unfinished, ink trailing off like a sentence that couldn't be completed. He reached out slowly, and his hand, warm, unbearably warm, tilted her chin upward. She met his eyes. And something moved across his face. Something old and broken and completely out of place on a man like him. Russo, he said quietly. Not a question. Asterisk, you have her eyes. Asterisk. Gianna's breath stopped. Asterisk whose? Asterisk, she whispered. His jaw tightened. Asterisk, my wife's. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Wife. Gianna's mind scrambled backward through everything she'd ever heard about Romeo Ferrara, the rumors, the whispers, the name mothers used to quiet difficult children, and not once, not in any version of his legend, had anyone mentioned a wife. Romeo was already moving. He turned away from her and walked to the small table by the window, where a bottle of Barolo sat breathing in the dark. He didn't pour it into a glass. He carried it to the bed. What are you? She started. They'll check, he said simply. In this family, they always check. He tipped the bottle. Dark wine bled into the white linen, slow and spreading, and the rose petals absorbed it at the edges until the bed looked like exactly what his family needed it to look like. Gianna watched with a kind of horror that had nothing to do with the wine and everything to do with understanding, for the first time, the architecture of the world she'd been dropped into. How many rules existed here? How many eyes? Romeo set the bottle down. He looked at her. You're not my property, he said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of something decided long before tonight. Whatever my family believes, whatever your father's ledger says, I don't operate that way. She almost laughed. Almost. You bought me. I intercepted you. His jaw shifted. There's a difference. If I hadn't signed that ledger, someone else would have. Someone who wouldn't be having this conversation. The truth of that settled over her like cold water. So what happens now? She asked. Now you play the role. He straightened his cuffs, composed again, the crack she'd seen in him when he'd said wife already sealed over. Devoted. Obedient. Mine. In public, you give them nothing to question. In private, he glanced at the stained sheets. This room is yours. I won't cross that line. Not until you choose to let me. Until, not unless. She caught it. She could tell by the slight tension around his eyes that he'd meant her to catch it. And if I never choose? She asked. Something moved behind his gaze. Dark and patient, and terrifyingly certain. Then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you're safe enough to have that luxury. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. Once. He looked at the screen, and every trace of warmth evacuated his face, instantly replaced by something cold and operational that made her realize she'd only ever been seeing the part of him he'd chosen to show her. Stay in this room, he said, already moving toward the door. Don't open it for anyone. Anyone, Gianna? What's happening? He paused with his hand on the frame, his back to her, the tattoos disappearing into shadow. Your father, he said quietly, just turned up alive. He came back an hour later. Gianna knew because she'd counted the minutes the way she used to count her mother's breaths in the hospital, not because counting helped, but because it gave her hands something to do besides shake. Romeo closed the door behind him. He didn't explain where he'd been or what had happened downstairs. He simply lowered himself into the chair across from the bed and leaned forward, elbows on knees, and stared at the floor like it owed him something. She should have stayed quiet. She knew that. But the word father was still detonating slowly inside her chest. The tattoos, she said. What do they mean? He looked up. She held his gaze. I want to know who you are. If I'm going to survive being married to you, I need to know who I'm surviving. A long silence. Then Romeo extended his right hand, palm down, and she leaned forward to look. Each one is a decision, he said quietly. Not always a life. Sometimes a choice that ended one. The thorns, he turned his hand slightly. Those are the ones that cost me something too. She studied the ink. Roses climbing toward his wrist, thorns curling back, petals dense and layered with the kind of detail that required hours in a chair and a specific kind of stillness. Each bloom slightly different. Each one finished. Except one. The rose on his middle knuckle. The one she'd noticed immediately. The outline was there, clean and deliberate, but the interior was bare. Empty. Waiting. That one, she said. Romeo's hand slowly closed into a fist. That one was meant for your father. His voice was flat, factual, the way people speak about things they've had years to make peace with and haven't. When a debt goes unpaid long enough in my world, you mark the closure. You finish the rose. It means the account is settled. But you didn't finish it. No. Why? He stood. Moved to the window. Outside, Chicago glittered indifferently against the dark. Because 18 years ago, he said slowly, your father saved my wife's life. Before he became what he became. Before the gambling, the debt, the disappearing. He exhaled. A man can only carry so much. Gianna's throat tightened. So you spared him. I had spared him. Romeo turned. His eyes were cold in a way that hadn't been there before. But he's surfacing tonight alive and in contact with people who want you used as leverage against me, his jaw locked, means that mercy may have just put a target on both our backs. He crossed the room in 4 strides and crouched to her eye level, his unfinished knuckle inches from her face. I need you to tell me everything you know about where your father might run, he said quietly. Every city. Every name. Every habit. His eyes searched hers. Urgent now. Stripped of all the careful composure. Because if they reach him before I do, Gianna, they won't just use him. They'll use you. Stay with me until the end, because this story will shock you to the core. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now! Dawn came in through the curtains like an apology, pale, uncertain, not quite enough. Gianna had talked for 2 hours. Every city her father had ever mentioned in a nostalgic moment. Every name she'd overheard through thin apartment walls. Every habit, every pattern, every tell. She'd handed Romeo the architecture of a man she'd spent years trying to love despite everything, and she'd done it without flinching, because somewhere between midnight and morning she had made a quiet, irreversible decision. She was done being something that happened to other people. Romeo had listened without interrupting. He'd written nothing down, which told her he was the kind of man whose memory was its own weapon. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, you understand what this means. What we have to be. Tell me anyway. In public, devoted. Untouchable. A couple that no one inside or outside this family would dare destabilize. His eyes met hers. In private, honest. Whatever this is, we don't lie to each other. That's the only currency I trust. She almost said that's not a marriage, that's a business arrangement, but she looked at his unfinished knuckle resting on the table between them and understood that for Romeo Ferrara, trust was intimacy. It was the closest thing to love a man like him knew how to offer. All right, she said quietly. Then we have a deal. Something shifted in his expression. subtle and devastating. He reached across the table, not to take her hand, just to rest his beside hers, close enough to feel the warmth. It was the most tender thing she'd ever seen a dangerous man do. Then his phone lit up. A single message. No name. Just coordinates and 3 words that made Romeo's face drain of every trace of the man she'd glimpsed tonight. He stood slowly, looked at her with something that might have been regret. "They found your father," he said. A pause that lasted a lifetime. Asterisk, he was already dead. Asterisk.